court intervened in a presidential election. I thought we would kind of look at it more from a comparative perspective and see, did you have any other Supreme Courts around the world kind of in a similar period of time intervene in a presidential election that was kind of a stalemate, as we kind of saw in Bush versus Gore? So the country that I'm going to look at here is Ukraine. So it's necessary to give you a little bit of history into the modern young nation of Ukraine. So Ukraine has existed for a while. There was even kind of a brief period of time where there was a Ukrainian state after World War I, but a little bit before the Russian Civil War. But it was a part of the Soviet Union. Before that, it was part of Russia, but not all of it. You know, parts of it in the West were parts of Poland, and before that, in some cases, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So, when you have the Soviet Union is established, you have 15 states within the Soviet Union, so Soviet Socialist Republics, as they were known. And outside of Russia, the most important one was Ukraine. Ukraine, outside of Russia, is the largest country in size in Europe today. So the Soviet Union breaks up. You have it basically dissolves. And a lot of those former states decide that they want to become independent countries. So you end up with, instead of the Soviet Union, you have 15 independent states. So Ukraine declares its independence on August the 24th, 1991. And a little bit later it was approved in a referendum that 92% of the voters voted for, with an 84% turnout. I think that we would love to have an 84% turnout in elections in the United States. We think about in the 2020 election, we had about a 2/3 turnout and thought that that was great. Here you have an 84% turnout. Now, if you look here, so that's one of the celebrations whenever Ukraine was declaring its independence there. You can see their flag. I'll tell you a little bit about the flag here in a little bit, why the colors are that way. But the regions of Ukraine, or their version of states, are known as oblasts. What you can see there is that every single oblast in Ukraine voted in favor, very strongly, most of them, in favor of independence. But if you look down there kind of in that little part in the south, in the bottom part, that's Crimea and Sevastopol. So that was originally not actually part of Ukraine. It was transferred to Ukraine when Nikita Khrushchev was the general secretary in the Soviet Union. Transferred that over to Ukraine. When Ukraine declared independence, one of the provisions that was put in a treaty that Russia would have access to its naval base there. Also, the other thing to consider there is that that area of Crimea and Sevastopol, given that it was part of Russia until I think the 50s or the 60s, or I think the late 50s, the majority of the population there are ethnic Russians. So if you look there on the east side, what you can see as well, while it's still very substantial, you see that those two oblasts on the right, their numbers were a lot lower. So that's Donetsk and Luhansk. So to give you some, so one of the things is as well is that in some of the areas that had a lot more ethnic Russians, you had lower turnout for the referendum. So you look there in the West and you see that those oblasts, it was almost unanimous in some of them in favor of independence. So I think we have to, in order to get to the 2004 election, we have to figure out what and how the government of Ukraine is set up. So, Ukraine has a presidential system with a parliament. So, the president is elected in a 2-round voting system. So, this is similar, let's say, to the way that France conducts its presidential elections. And that is that you have where everybody that wants to run, you have parties there as you do here, but you have more than one party, of course, in most countries outside of the United States. Viable parties, I should say. They put up their candidates, people go to vote, and if someone were to get a majority in the first round, they would be elected. So this is actually similar, if you will, to, let's say, the election system in Louisiana, except it's an open primary there, and this is each party is choosing their candidates. But there are a lot of independent candidates, you'll notice. So the first election was in 1991. It was the first former Soviet state to have an election. Now, the president was going to serve 5-year terms, but kind of one of the agreements was initially that there would be the second elections in Ukraine in 1994. So one of the things that you're going to find in some of these elections, you had people of the same name running against each other. So the incumbent president who had won in 1991 was Leonid Kravchuk. He was defeated by Leonid Kuchma in 1994. So an important thing that I think I might have mentioned a little bit earlier is a country having its first election is very important. But a country having its first election where the incumbent party or the incumbent loses, and then you have a peaceful transfer of power, that is even more important. So it was the first former Soviet state to see a peaceful transfer of power as well. So the parliament in Ukraine, so maybe if you will, our version of Congress, is known as the, I'm going to botch this, but the Verkhovna Rada. Most people just call it the Rada. It has 450 members. So it has changed as far as how it elects the members. So the next time that you have a Rada election, it will be by proportional representation by party, and you'll have to have 5% to be 5% of the vote to be able to get seats. In some elections, you've had everybody elected in single-member districts. In some elections, it's been split. So you'll have a vote, maybe similar to like in Germany, where you would vote for a single-member person, and then you would vote for proportional representation. So elections are, unlike in the United States where we have our congressional elections, let's say, where they're timed at the same time as the presidential election if they fall in those years, these are held a little bit after the presidential election. So kind of similar to France, if you will. So if you look at early Ukrainian democracy, what you saw is that beginning in the 1994 election, you saw a split between the west and central parts of the country, and, if you will, the east and southern parts. So why do you have this split? Well, some of it we're going to see as some linguistic and ethnic reasons, but a lot of it is, where are you located? So if you live in the west and the central part, so the central part is the largest part there is the capital of Kyiv, you favor generally more closer ties to Europe. Are you going to get in the European Union? Probably not likely for a while. NATO, that's something that we'll discuss a little bit later. But, you want to try to get integrated into the European economy. So, for instance, Ukraine eventually gets into what's known as Schengen. I'm probably botching the pronunciation there. And it means that people in the country can travel within the Schengen zone without a visa. Now, if you live closer to the east, especially the east, and to a lesser degree in the southern part, and yeah, let's kind of separate out the Crimean Peninsula with that. You're closer to Russia, and you favor more closer ties to Moscow. But one of the things that you'll see, so you see the picture that I have there at the top, that is the 1994 election. So you can see that Kravchuk is supported in the western and central parts, including Kiev, while Kuchma, who wins by a fairly decent margin, is supported in the east and in the south, and to a little bit to some of the areas. He has a little bit of strength in the some parts of the central part. So you can see in the central part it's a lot closer. But then you look, let's say, into the 1999 presidential election, where Kuchma is running for re-election. You can see there that it's not a perfect correlation. So you can see that Kuchma now is dominating in the western oblasts, in some cases getting over 90% of the vote. But he also wins some places in the east, and then some places in the south. So what you don't see is kind of the perfect correlation really until the 2004 election. And there are some reasons for this. So Boris Yeltsin, you may remember him. A lot of you might not be old enough to remember, but he was the first president of Russia after the breakup of the Soviet Union. He was a rather colorful character, known to take a drink from time to time. There was a story that during the Clinton administration, he was staying, I think, somewhere close to the White House, and was drunk and ran around part of Washington in his underwear. You may see some pictures of him dancing. But one of the things about Boris Yeltsin is that he was close to the Clinton administration, before that the Bush administration, and they basically, the Yeltsin presidency said, you know what, to the other 14 states, you can kind of take the path that you want. Well, one of the things that, there were certain security guarantees made to Ukraine, including that was one of the reasons that they gave up their nuclear weapons. In hindsight, that doesn't seem like as good of an idea. But one of the things that you did see is that the three Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, they moved very quickly to get into Europe, as you will. So they are NATO members, which is very critical because there's Article 5 of NATO that says, basically, if one country is attacked, all countries are attacked. So that's one of the things that Ukraine would like to be able to eventually join, is NATO. And that's one thing that Vladimir Putin does not want them to join. But when you get Putin in office in Russia, he wants to bring more countries into the sphere of Moscow. So, he knows he's lost the Baltic states. He's not doing that well in the Caucasus. He has Central Asia. I'm not that familiar with too much there. But the thing to remember, it's not the biggest in as far as size, as far as the former Soviet Socialist republics. But Ukraine is the most important one. And there are long-standing things that Moscow would like. And that would be like to put Ukraine back under its thumb. So you have a guy named Viktor Yanukovych, who is from Donetsk, which is in the far eastern part of the country of Ukraine. It is heavily supported in the east, and one of the things that they had supported was trying to make things better for Russian speakers within Ukraine. So many people in Ukraine speak both Russian and Ukrainian. Though more people speak Ukrainian more as their primary language. You've seen that more Ukrainians over the past few years have identified Ukrainian as their primary language. So you kind of have where about 2/3 of Ukrainians are primary Ukrainian speakers. Like I said, even though many of them, um, especially as you keep getting further east, do also speak Russian. It's one of those things where is it the same language? No, not at all. But there are some similarities. I'll put it like that. And then you have about a sixth of the country are ethnic Russians who speak Russian, and then you have ethnic Ukraine. About a sixth is ethnic Ukrainians that's primary language is Russian, which is kind of a little bit of contradiction there. But um, one of the things is that Yanukovych and the Party of Regions wanted to add Russian as the official second language, or as a maybe not even a second language, or kind of a co-official language. So he was closely allied with Russia and Vladimir Putin. Now, the first election that you would see where Putin is in charge of Russia is in 2004. So there were two main candidates, Viktor Yanukovych. So I think it's always confusing that you have people have the same first name, but it happens. So another former prime minister was Viktor Yushchenko, who favored a lot closer ties to Europe. So during the campaign, one of the things that happened to Viktor Yushchenko was he was poisoned with dioxin, which I think they would believe that it had some elements of Agent Orange in it. This happened a little bit before the election. So you can see the picture of what it did to his disfigurement of his face. He's lucky he didn't die. But you can see there, on the left, very, very handsome man. And then on the other side, you're kind of like, oh my gosh, did he age like to 110 overnight? Russia was the likely suspect, I think we know. So in the two-round system, Yushchenko led Yanukovych by about a point, 40 to 39. But since neither person had a majority, there was a runoff 3 weeks later. So here's one of the strange things that happened in the runoff. The exit polls showed Yushchenko, that guy there, with an 11-point lead. So exit polls are not perfect, but they give you some ideas, and it makes you think, well, if things are a little bit different, well, maybe there's something going on. So some districts in the east saw turnout at or above 100%, including in Donetsk, which is the home base of Yanukovych. There were some electoral districts where turnout was 100, or was not just 100%, it was like 127%. So there were allegations of ballot stuffing, intimidation of the polls, that basically people were going around voting in a lot of places. So Yanukovych won as far as, you just think about this as far as turnout. Do you think that the first round and the second round are going to have substantially different turnout? Probably not a whole lot. Maybe it increases the second round because people know it's for the presidency. But in the Oblast where the turnout had increased dramatically, Yanukovych won all but one. So he wins the second round, 49 to 47. So you're probably wondering, okay, if there's a runoff, why does that not equal 100? Well, one of the reasons is some people, they will count votes, they will note votes that are blank, and there's also the choice to vote against both of them. So that's where you get that few percent there. So let's kind of look at this. So we're going to see that there's going to be a third round of voting. But let's look at the results by Oblast. So what you can see there, if you look at the map, is that the second round, which was annulled, you see that Yanukovych wins really big in the east, especially in those two in the far east. So the two on the kind of the far right. And those are Donetsk, the one where he gets 93.54%, and Luhansk, which is the one where he gets 92%, 91.24. So in Europe, what we use as a decimal point, they use as a comma. If you're wondering why that is the case. So you can see that he also does extremely well in Crimea and Sevastopol. So 81% and nearly 89%. On the other hand, you look kind of going to the west, and you see that Yushchenko wins more than 90% in several of the oblasts on the left side. So in Volyn, in Lviv, in Ternopil. There's also ones where he's getting well over 80%. You can see that you see the kind of the red dot that kind of goes there. That is the capital of Kyiv. So he wins nearly 80% of the vote there. So several other oblasts where he's getting, a substantial amount. So Cherkasy, Kemalskyi. Where else are we looking at here? Ivano-Frankivsk. So you see that there's a lot of regional voting. So we're going to see that there's actually going to be a third round, but I wanted to go ahead and put that on there now. So you can see that some of the totals. It seems like for Yanukovych increase as far as percentages over on the second round, but you're not getting as many fraudulent votes. Is kind of where some of that kind of changes a little bit. So why some of the stark differences? So let's look at this. So, okay, let's keep this, look back. So an ethno-linguistic map of Ukraine. So if you look at the red, mostly Ukrainian speaking, predominantly Ukrainian speaking, you have the pink. But then you look there in the Crimean Peninsula in Sevastopol, ethnic Russian majority there. And then you look at kind of the yellow striped with brown in the east. Those are areas where it's mostly Russian-speaking people, but with a really substantial Russian ethnic minority population. So, for instance, in Luhansk and Donetsk, you see that the ethnic Russian population is about, in between 35 and 40%. So you're probably thinking, well, how'd that happen? Well, I think you probably know why it is the case in Crimea, because it was once part of Russia. Now it's part of Russia again. But during the famine and some other things, some parts of eastern Ukraine filled up with some people coming across from Russia. And then you see that there are some areas that you see kind of there in the south that are, a little bit more of a mix again, predominantly Russian speaking, but probably also know a lot of Ukrainian. And then you see a few other places. You see Carpathian Ukrainians. You see a few areas that are on some borders where you have Romanian, Moldovan, Hungarian, Bulgarian populations. But it's really clear that you see that kind of if you're looking at this, you kind of just think, that correlates. So, some other things that you have to consider about the country is that the capital of Kyiv is a very cosmopolitan place. Very European. People there would like to be part of Europe. They don't really want to go back towards Moscow. But then other parts. So I remember I told you a little bit about the flag. So the blue and kind of the yellowish gold. So that's kind of what it's based off of. The blue sky and the yellow golden fields. Because one of the things to remember is that Ukraine is it's known as the breadbasket of Europe. It produces a lot of agriculture. So, it's the largest producer in the world of sunflower seeds. It's in the top 10 in the world in lots of different categories. So, corn, wheat, potatoes, sugar beets, which you can also use to make ethanol or sugar, barley, rapeseed, cabbage, apples, pumpkins, cucumbers, carrots, peas, rye, buckwheat, walnuts, soy, onion, grapes, oats, watermelon, cherries. It's also one of the biggest producers of honey in the world. So agriculture is a very important part of the country. So the West is a lot more agricultural versus the East is, especially when you get over towards Donetsk. So Donetsk is also the most populated oblast in the country. About 10% of the population lives in Donetsk. You also have in the south, you actually have very beautiful beaches if you're kind of thinking about, say, Odessa. But that's not to say that there isn't a lot of agriculture in most of the country. It's just that it's a little bit more dominant in the West than in the East. So a little bit of some of the reactions to the runoff. So international observers looked at this, like the European Union, the United States, and they said something is fishy. Something is wrong. So Russia and Putin were very happy with the result. This would lead to closer ties to Russia. This would mean that Ukraine would not be trying to integrate with the European Union. This would mean that there, less ties to Europe. No chance of NATO. So Yanukovych seemed to promise that, if the government didn't accept the results, maybe the East and the South would break away. Maybe the country should split apart. And if they split apart, would those places become independent? Or would they become part of Russia? Likely the thing is they would probably become their own states, but they would be more or less client states to Russia. So the Rada, where Yanukovych was sworn in, was half empty. It lacked a quorum. So what happens here is what's known as the Orange Revolution. So hundreds of thousands of people protested in Maidan Square, which is Independence Square in Kyiv, and all around the country. It turns out that there were actually pro-Yanukovych protests in other parts of the country, especially in the South and especially in the East. But it's estimated that 20% of Ukrainians took some part in protests around the country. So I want to show you this clip here from NBC showing what they saw, kind of looking back.
Demonstrators clash with police, hundreds of thousands protesting the results of the election and calling for a new vote. Hundreds of thousands of pro-democracy Ukrainians in the streets today protested against the results of the presidential election, pitting their candidate, the West-leaning challenger Viktor Yushchenko, against the pro-Moscow Prime Minister Viktor Yanukovych. They claim Yanukovych's victory was rigged with reports of ballot stuffing and voter intimidation.
Last night, the country's election commission ignored reports of fraud, declaring Kremlin-backed Viktor Yanukovych the winner. Far from backing down, Yushchenko has called for a nationwide strike, warning the country is on the verge of civil war.
If they shoot us, if they send tanks, no matter what, there's nothing that can overpower the will of the people.
Meanwhile, overseas in Ukraine today, anti-government demonstrators finally had something to celebrate. The parliament voted to disband the government of the candidate who has been declared the winner of the disputed presidential election.
The ruling called for a revote in 3 weeks.
Doctors confirmed that opposition candidate Viktor Yushchenko was poisoned during the campaign. NBC's Pat Dawson reports.
The effects were startling. The healthy, vibrant opposition candidate for Ukraine's presidency transformed in a matter of a few weeks this fall into a gravely ill man. His face almost overnight changed into a scarred, bloated mask.
In Kiev's Independence Square, where the historic protest began over a month ago, opposition leader Viktor Yushchenko joined his supporters in a victory celebration early this morning. With most votes counted, the Western-leaning economist leads by an insurmountable 9 percentage points. He thanked the hundreds of thousands who had taken to the streets to demand democratic change. Earlier, his opponent, the Soviet-style Prime Minister Viktor Yanukovych, looked defeated but conceded nothing and predicted more turmoil ahead. I am ready to lead, he said, but if I lose, Yushchenko will find out what opposition really means.
Demonstrate.
So the reason that I put this in here, following Bush versus Gore, is that the Ukrainian Supreme Court ends up intervening. So the Ukrainian Supreme Court is not quite the same thing as it was back then. It's been reformed. You have the Ukrainian Constitutional Court. But they stepped in to break the deadlock. So due to the scale of electoral fraud, they invalidate the runoff, order an election on December the 26th. So I know some of you probably, whenever I teach this in person, are probably thinking, you're having it the day after Christmas? Well, most Ukrainians celebrate Christmas on January the 7th. So today, actually, both Christmases, Orthodox and Catholic Christmases, are state holidays. But the vast majority celebrated on the Orthodox day of January the 7th because of the Julian calendar rather than the Gregorian calendar. The area that celebrates it more in the is in the far west, some of the areas where there's a large Greek Catholic population. So the rerun, Yushchenko wins 52 to 44 by an 8-point margin. So Yanukovych was very disappointed, but he accepts the results. There were, again, like I said, protests in favor of Yushchenko in the east and in the south. So one of the things I think that Yanukovych was thinking is, you know what, I can run again. So he does run again. There's another election in 2010. Yushchenko was very unpopular by then. I think he ends up getting 4 or 5% of the vote in the first round. So the other leading opposition candidate was former Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko. You can see her there. Sometimes you will see that she has her blonde hair braided. But that election had some issues. Tymoshenko originally said she was not going to accept the result. It was by about a 4-point margin. She eventually exhausted her legal challenges, but there were less problems than in 2004. International observers said that the election was fair. There were problems. There clearly were. But one of the thoughts was that some people speculated that the reason that Tymoshenko might have came out on the losing end is that Yushchenko wanted to keep some positions for him and his supporters and may have encouraged some of his voters to vote for Yanukovych instead of Tymoshenko, who he had actually previously been allied with in 2004. You may have, if you look closely at some of those pictures in that video, you may have actually saw that Tymoshenko was sitting behind Viktor Yushchenko. So now, so what do we get? So, oh my gosh, we see kind of the same map again. So we see, especially looking over in the Donbass, especially if you're looking at, Donetsk and Luhansk, just very, very, very deep blue colors for Yanukovych. Now, if you move further to the west, places like Lviv, you see very strong red and pink colors for Tymoshenko. You also see that Kyiv, the capital, voted very strongly for Tymoshenko. So that's one of the things to keep in mind as well, is that the capital of Kyiv, very much pro-Western. It's those areas to the it's those areas that border Russia more to the south and the east that are more pro-Russia. So you're probably thinking, is there a little bit more? Yes, there is. You know, do you have some problems with Viktor Yanukovych? Yes, he was a crook. One of the things is that he led a very opulent, extravagant lifestyle. He steered a lot. He steered almost half of discretionary government money over to Donetsk and Luhansk. So he then proceeded to move much closer to Russia. This led in Kyiv and other places to what is known as the Euromaidan protests. So again, in Maidan Square, the Revolution of Dignity. Another thing that came up is that he was a big crook. People didn't exactly like that. So the Revolution of Dignity, the court action was not needed here. So Yanukovych was facing impeachment by the Rada. And later, because one of the things that he did, he ordered that government troops fire on protesters. And there were protesters that died during this. Thank goodness not a whole lot, considering what could have happened. And later, he's faced threats of arrest for murder of the protesters and the corruption. I think that one of the things after he fled to Russia, where he still lives, there was a place that he lived out in the country, and it had just very, very fancy stuff. Very expensive stuff, which he may have gotten at the expense of the citizens of Ukraine. So, kind of the interesting thing that happens here is that with Yanukovych gone, Putin figures that he can't necessarily influence Ukraine as much through the ballot box. Now he's going to do it militarily. So Russia, so you may have heard of the little green men thing. They annexed Crimea and Sevastopol. So you also had a Russian-backed insurgency in the Donbass. So Donetsk and Luhansk, where you literally have, you had a war went on that's went on since 2014, though it became not as hot of a war after the Minsk Accords, but it still goes on to this day. The people of Ukraine have to worry about what Putin wants to do next. Is Putin's goal to, let's say, overthrow the entire government in Kyiv? Or let's say, is it basically to split off parts of Ukraine? I think he would like to overthrow the government in Kyiv, but I think that probably more likely a scenario is probably to try to just have parts off of it. Because Luhansk and Donetsk are heavily industrialized parts of Ukraine. You have to just think about it. If all of a sudden you took several states out of the United States and made them independent countries that weren't exactly friendly to the rest of the country, that could create a lot of problems with the national economy there. You had a lot of protests to Yanukovych being taken out as the president. New elections actually ended up producing a new president, Petro Poroshenko, who was a candy billionaire. So if you've ever bought Roshen chocolate, that's his company. So, interestingly enough, this election he wins without a runoff. But if you look in the Donbass, which again is Luhansk and Donetsk, only 20% of the polling stations were open. Now, Poroshenko was very, very pro-Western. He ends up not getting reelected. I don't have this on the slide. In 2019, he actually loses to the current president, Vladimir Zelensky, who is actually very young and was a comedian. Who actually had a show where he played the president. So, also in that election, not many of the polling places in the Donbass were open either. And he ends up winning. He ends up winning in the runoff by a massive margin. I think it was like 73-27. So that's kind of where we stand with Ukraine. So hope you've enjoyed kind of a dive into a little bit of comparative politics here. Kind of looking at a young country where you had that the Supreme Court ends up having to look at an election that was clearly fraudulent. Not like the 2020 election, where you had in the United States that basically every court in the United States said that Donald Trump's arguments of corruption corrupt election were completely unfounded. It was more just a sore loser. That was not the case, clearly, with the 2004 election in Ukraine. There clearly was fraud. And, one of the things, of course, is that whenever you're dealing with an election that you find fraud, what is the remedy? Maybe the fraud is so small it wouldn't make a difference. But, is the proper remedy to overturn election the result? Or is it, let's say, to have a rerun? And that's what the Supreme Court of Ukraine did. So I think that if they would have just simply overturned the election, it would have been a bigger problem. It would have been a problem versus having a rerun and having more international observers and more procedures that the RADA put in place to try to ensure that the election was going to be with less corruption and fraud. So that is all, and we will pick up with our section on elections next time.